I'm Dr. Eben Alexander III, former Harvard neurosurgeon and author of books Proof of Heaven, Map of Heaven, and Living in a Mindful Universe. And I live right outside of Charlottesville, Virginia. And my NDE was a very profound shift in my life. I had spent the first 54 years of my life honing a very kind of modern, conventional scientific worldview. I had taught at Harvard Medical School for over 15 years in neurosurgery, thought I understood something about brain, mind, and consciousness. And I must confess, I had kind of converged on a conventional materialist or physicalist view, that is, that the brain creates consciousness and that our existence and consciousness is birth to death and nothing more. And I was about to learn in my NDE that that was impossible, that we were much more than that. Really interconnected souls. I mean, that was kind of the grand message. And I've spent the 15 years since my coma working with other scientists around the world, trying to come to a deeper understanding. Now, important to point out that one of the unusual features of my near-death experience was amnesia, that I didn't remember the events of Eben Alexander's life. In fact, I had no words, no language, no knowledge of this earth or this universe. It really was an empty slate going in. And only in the months and years after the coma did I realize why that empty slate was so important for me to really, harbor all the great lessons of the journey and not be so tempted by my prior materialist prejudices to dismiss it. And that's why it had to be quite an extraordinary journey, which it turned out to be. Now, also important to point out that not only is my story told in Proof of Heaven, but there's a medical review of my medical records, a case report in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, September 2018, by doctors Serbi Khanna, Lauren Moore, and Bruce Grayson. And that case report does a world of good for really demonstrating two things. One is that my brain was far too incapacitated based on neurologic exams, on CT and MRI scans, based on lab values, et cetera. There was no way that brain was going to harbor any kind of dream or hallucination. This is one of the reasons why my story is so important to the neuroscientific community, because it really kind of closes the case in our thoughts that the brain is the creator of consciousness and opens the door to much grander possibilities of the nature of consciousness. So getting right deep into my NDE, everything had actually been going very well in my life, very healthy. And then at 4:30 in the morning, November 10th, 2008, woke up with severe back pain, severe headache. Of course, anyone out there in medicine hearing of sudden onset of severe headache, back pain might think of meningitis, but the doctor was already out. My brain was being overrun by an extremely aggressive and should have killed me bacterial meningoencephalitis. I was on the way out, and I had no clue what was going on. But I was driven deep into coma, grand mal seizures, all of that while I was at home. There is a myth out in the kind of lay press about my case that it was a medically induced coma, but in fact, the reason it's so important to the scientific community is because the coma came in full force while I was at home, no sedating medications whatsoever. This is the meningitis attacking my brain, causing the coma. And that's what allows for some profound realizations about the brain-mind relationship once you recognize that deep truth. Now, where it all started for me, what I remember about the experience itself, it began in what I call the earthworm's eye view, a very primitive, coarse, unresponsive realm. It was like being in dirty jello, had no body awareness at all, but I was a speck of awareness. And I remember a sensation of roots or blood vessels all around me. It was like being underground and, dirty jello. And of course, it sounds foreboding for me to talk about it. And yet, given my amnesia, my complete lack of knowledge of anything prior, it was just existence. I accepted it as it was without any complaints whatsoever. Luckily, it didn't last forever. I was rescued by a slowly spinning white light that came packaged with a perfect musical melody. And in fact, that light opened up like a rip in the fabric of that ugly earthworm eye view realm and led up into this brilliant, ultra real gateway valley. And this is where, the shock factor of being in a realm where everything can happen at once. Your entire life can be presented to you, birth to death, everything in between, and a reliving of those events. I mean, these life reviews that people have described in NDEs going back thousands of years don't begin to do justice until you recognize what people are saying about these experiences. But it's completely outside of time and our notion of temporal relationship and earth time. Um, and in that Gateway Valley, it had many Earth-like features. I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. There were millions of other butterflies looping and spiraling in these vast formations. We were above this meadow, beautiful, verdant, fertile meadow. In fact, I would say that this world was very much like Plato's world of ideals, but for the individual soul. There was no sign of any death or decay. And I remember on that butterfly wing, the sensation of a soft summer breeze blowing through. And even though the elements of the scene, as I would describe them, might stay the same, that soft summer breeze, as I called it in my writings weeks later, the breath of God, the divine wind, that was my first awareness of that infinitely loving power, that God force at the core of the universe. That's what so many NDEers encounter, and what gives them the kind of hope and promise of the reality of ongoing conscious awareness, even after bodily death. That is really one of the biggest gifts that the NDE community brings to this world, once you realize that the scientific study of NDEs greatly validates their reality and their demonstration of a spiritual realm that is kind of much more our spiritual home than the material realm, even though the material realm is where we get the work done. This is where we grow as souls, not in those spiritual realms. And so anyway, back in my Gateway Valley, the best part about it, I was witnessing thousands of beings down below, souls dancing. I call them souls between lives in my writings weeks later. Um, Lots of joy and merriment, and children playing, dogs jumping, and it was all being fueled because up above were these swooping orbs, angelic choirs that were emanating chants and anthems, hymns that would just thunder through my awareness, this incredible majesty, but also this rich kind of beauty of the unconditional love of the creator for the creation. That's basically the kind of love that one feels in that realm, and feeling very much at home there. As much as my words may sound foreign to some people, many people, reading these words, thousands of people contacted me after Proof of Heaven came out because they had had a similar experience, even though they often would never have told anybody about it to this point. And that's why I'm glad Proof of Heaven has served as a catalyst to allow people to share their own stories much more readily, because it's a shocking reality that you encounter there. How do you explain it? And to realize that millions of others have gone through this is very helpful to people. So in this Gateway Valley, on this butterfly wing, there was another beautiful guardian angel. And I'll never forget the way she looked at me, her sparkling blue eyes, high cheekbones, high forehead, soft brown hair framing her lovely face. She was dressed in the same kind of simple but very colorful garb as all the people down below dancing in that meadow. And she looked at me with a look of pure love. And she never had to say a word. Her truth was delivered directly into my mind. We had this beautiful kind of overlap of mental, emotional reality. And her message to me, that I put into words weeks later: you are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are richly cared for. And I wish I'd explained it a little better in the book Proof of Heaven, but the other part of the message was you can do no wrong. Now, of course, when I said that, when I recognized that, I already knew that that infinitely loving power of that God force in that realm of the universe made it very clear that our optimal pathway forward as souls is to show love, compassion, kindness, mercy, acceptance to all fellow beings, and not just human beings. This is all about consciousness, which contains all of sentient life. So it's really a deep lesson of oneness and of connection that NDEs are trying to drive to us, that actually has tremendous overlap with the modern neuroscience of consciousness and all of our efforts to understand the nature of reality. So it's a very important lesson for all of us to learn. Now, it turns out that in this Gateway Valley with these beautiful chants, anthems, and hymns flowing down from these angelic choirs above, that provided yet another musical portal. As it turns out, my first portal coming up from the earthworm eye view into the Gateway Valley came with a perfect musical melody. And it was by remembering the notes of that melody that I could later conjure up that light portal again and again, because I would go through these spiritual levels, but then spontaneously fall back down to that earthworm eye view. And I think this is a lesson to me about the various levels of consciousness in the spiritual realm and about the limitations of any consciousness associated with the physical brain. Because my brain at that time was under severe attack from this E. coli meningoencephalitis. And in fact, that part was a real gift. I mentioned that case report a little while ago and how they made the point that this could not have been a dream or hallucination because that brain was too incapacitated to have a dream or hallucination. Well, the other main conclusion of that case report, because they were challenged by the peer review scientific editors at the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases who said, this case is absurd. How do you explain it? No one's ever been this sick with this kind of bacterial meningitis and then come back to this world with a full recovery. And the response from the three doctors was, it's because he had a near-death experience. And to the peer-reviewed scientific editors of that journal, that was sufficient. They said, okay, now we have an explanation. They knew of other cases of profound healing after a near-death experience. And I think that's one of the most important lessons for all of us about NDEs and what they indicate to us about our spiritual nature and the potential we have for healing and bringing wholeness and healing into our own lives. Because that is a very common story in the NDE literature, is having a very deadly illness and then having a remarkable recovery. In some of these cases, like mine, Anita Morjani's healing of her lymphoma, Dr. Mary C. Neal's healing of her over 30-minute warm water drowning. These are all examples of NDEs intervening to give us unexpectedly great healing and coming into wholeness after these kind of close encounters with death. Now, as it turns out, this was not the end point of my journey, though. Those angelic choirs provided that portal to a higher and higher level. I remember seeing all of four-dimensional space-time collapsing down, all of what I call deep time or meta time in that associated spiritual realm. And note that those life reviews are not only more real than ordinary memories of lived events, but they are also lived as if you're reliving and not just remembering the events in the life review. And even more important is that, according to Bruce Grayson, who studied these cases for over 45 years, that something like 74% of the life reviews, people have the sense of experiencing it through the feelings and eyes of others around them who were affected by their thoughts and actions. So your life review is an example of how we're sharing the dream of the one mind, how we're all in this together. We're here to learn and teach these beautiful spiritual lessons, but that ultimately none of us is an individual apart from the others. It's a mutual effort of growth and transformation. And that's why this community of near-death experiencers is so important, because studied in large mass by scientific researchers, you start to discern these incredible patterns that show this much grander universe in which we live. Now, for me, as all of that collapsed down, all that four-dimensional space-time, it collapsed into this complex oversphere that to me was the universe through all eternity. But at that point, I was out in the core. The core was a resolution of all dualities and paradoxes into oneness, recognizing that the very source of conscious awareness was that God force of pure love at the core of the universe. This was a great revelation to me, certainly far beyond anything that my upbringing in a Methodist church in North Carolina back in the late 20th century would have allowed. But becoming one with God was an essential part of this whole thing, and realizing that all of us are sourced in that beautiful loving force. And at that level of the universe, there's no battle between good and evil. That only is an apparent battle way out here in the periphery, in the material realm. But ultimately, those forces of good and love are the forces that determine the evolution of all of sentience throughout the cosmos. So in that core realm, I was taught many things, also told you'll be going back. You're not here to stay. And I would tumble back down spontaneously to that earthworm eye view. By remembering the musical notes, the melody, I could conjure up that light portal, come back up into that beautiful Gateway Valley, always welcomed by the same beautiful spiritual guide on the butterfly wing, and then off through the angelic choirs to more lessons in the core. But there did come a time when I could no longer conjure up that light portal once I fell into the earthworm's eye view. To say I was sad at that point would be a vast understatement, but I also knew I could trust that I would be taken care of. My passages with that guardian angel and through the core realm and that oneness with that divine God force had shown me I could depend on the universe to take care of me as long as I kept that love in my heart. And so what then happened was I witnessed thousands of beings around me going off into the distance, many with heads bowed like that, some holding candles, this murmuring energy coming from them. I couldn't understand any of the words, but the murmuring energy from their, what I later called prayers, was bringing me this incredible sense of love, connection, and of being in spiritual home, which I'd earlier felt simply in the Gateway Valley and the core realm, but now I was feeling down in these lowest realms. And when I wrote it all up weeks later, I said that was the power of prayer. That's what I was witnessing. And that's what was guiding me back to this world. But it was really the next phase of the journey that was so important. This was the final stage of my spiritual journey. And that's when I saw six faces that would kind of bubble up out of the muck. They'd say a few words and then they'd disappear. My amnesia was still very active, so I didn't understand what they were saying. But the thing is, those images were burned into my mind and my memory so that I remember them today as sharply as if all those six faces appeared to me yesterday morning. I mean, very sharp images. But at the time I saw them, I had no idea who they were. Importantly, five of them were people physically present in the ICU room the last 24 hours I was in coma. But the timing of all that was such that other close family and friends who had been there early in the week were not in my memories at all. And that's how it helped me to peg the vast majority of my journey to between days 1 and 4 or 1 and 5 of that 7-day coma. And that was very important in trying to make sense of it all, looking back on it. Now, it turns out it was the last of those faces that was the most important. That was of a 10-year-old boy. And it was my son, Bond. Now, I didn't recognize him because of my ongoing amnesia, but it was his pleading with me. That was day 7 of coma. The doctors had held a family conference that morning. They said I'd gone from a 10% chance of survival down to 2% with no chance of recovery. And that's when they advised that they take me off the ventilator, stop the antibiotics, and just let nature take its course. Well, it was a few hours after that I started coming back. But after overhearing that conversation, Bond, who had been protected from the worst news during that week, my 10-year-old son, came running down the hallway, pulled open my eyelids that were taped shut at the time on the ventilator, one eye looking up there, one eye over there, neither pupil working. Those of you in medicine will know what a horrible picture that is. At any rate, he was pleading with me, Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay. Now, I didn't see him with my eyes or hear him with my ears. I didn't understand the pleading, but I certainly felt the urgency of it and the need for me, the responsibility I had to this other soul. And throughout this entire journey, because of my amnesia, I thought it can continue, it can cease, it doesn't matter. Now, all of a sudden, everything did matter. And I realized that I had a responsibility to this other soul. And just as you often hear as a theme in NDE returns, it's out of a responsibility for someone else. Even though I didn't know that connection, I knew deeply that I had to be there for this other soul, for my son Bond. Of course, in retrospect, his name is far more appropriate than I ever realized before my coma. But it was soon thereafter that I started to open my eyes and fighting the ventilator. And that's when they pulled out the breathing tube. And I said, thank you. Now, I don't remember that. And I don't remember a lot of, the next few hours because I was in and out of a paranoid delusional psychotic nightmare in the 36 hours after they extubated me. But all of that was very important because those memories, even though they seemed a little more real than a normal nightmare, I was aware that they were delusions. As opposed to what happened deep in coma. Those memories are as sharp and solid and real and detailed today as if the whole thing happened yesterday. Whereas the memories of that post-extubation nightmare, those memories faded within a few weeks. And I'm glad I wrote a lot of that down because now I have a record of it all. In fact, my older son, Eben IV, who was majoring in neuroscience at the time, had advised me. He came home 2 days after I got out of the hospital. It was the day before Thanksgiving in 2008. He gave me this big hug. He drove overnight to surprise me because he'd heard I couldn't sleep. I was so energized by the experience. He got there at 6 a.m., big hug. And he told me later it was like this light shining within me. I was far more present than I'd ever been before. And what I told him, based on the advice of my doctors, I had tried to share my spiritual journey with my doctors, and they just pat me on the back and say, well, your brain was soaking in pus. We don't even understand how you're coming back to us now. But you can forget about it because a dying brain plays all kinds of tricks. Now, most of my neuroscience knowledge was not back yet. That took 2 months to come back. And also, I had not yet fully gone into my medical records, neurologic exams, scans, and all that, which I did over the next weeks and month or two. And that's where the shock hit me, because I started realizing that brain could not have mustered any experience like what I had. And yet, the most profound experience of my entire existence occurred when my brain was demonstrably offline and inactive. That, of course, is one of the biggest gifts of this entire journey. And it turns out that my memories did come back very much over the next 2 months after waking up from coma. And it was then that I really started diving deep into that NDE literature after I'd written 20,000 words over 6 weeks, reading that literature and realizing that, that guardian angel that I saw, the beautiful woman on the butterfly wing, I found that such guides are common in NDEs, and they're always someone very important to you in life. Now, if I had scripted this, that role would have been played by my father, my adoptive father, the world-renowned neurosurgeon who had been such a model for me in my career. And yet he was nowhere to be found in my NDE. And I discuss all that, especially in the third book, in Living in a Mindful Universe, because I did encounter his soul in meditation, using sacred acoustics. And people who want to learn more can go to sacredacoustics.com. But I've been using such meditation daily for the last 10 or 11 years to return to my NDE, not just to recover memories, but to develop rich relationships with the various guides and angels of that near-death experience, as well as to recover that infinitely healing sense of that loving God force. And I do that on a regular basis using sacred acoustics. In fact, Karen and I give workshops with sacred acoustics that help people who've never had an NDE meditate and start achieving similar goals to what happens in NDEs, to show us the reality of the afterlife and the greater abilities of our conscious awareness. And I've spent the 15 years since my coma trying to make sense of all this. The 10th anniversary edition of the book Proof of Heaven came out in October of 2022. And it has 36 additional pages that go into much more detail. And I must say that, of course, the book Living in a Mindful Universe that was co-written with my partner, Karen Newell, is the true proof of heaven. That's where we really try and bring the science and spirituality together in a book that's been endorsed by some of the leading scientists globally on consciousness studies. So this is really about helping the world to wake up to the fundamental nature of consciousness. I mean, the model emerging in modern science is one that I think would best be labeled something like evolutionary panentheism. So it goes beyond the idealism that we argued for in Living in a Mindful Universe, because it simply reflects our spiritual nature, and that oneness of mind is really related to that God force that we encounter on these deep journeys. And the reminder we keep getting from NDEs that it's the binding force of love that brings us together. And this lesson is absolutely crucial for humanity in the modern era, because the kind of false sense of separation of scientific materialism, where we think we're separate bodies and there's competition in a Darwinian sense, as opposed to recognizing what biologists have come to see in the last few decades, that collaboration and cooperation are far more important in the biological system than competition. And yet competition and that principle of Darwinian thought has reared its head in a lot of our banking and financial evolutionary systems, what have you. And it is time for us to move beyond that false narrative of separation that comes from materialism and realize we're all in this together. through that binding force of love. And if we truly want to be Homo sapiens, sapiens means wise. Well, ultimately, we need to learn this deep lesson of the primacy of mind, how we're all in this together, start taking care of the least, the last, and the lost, and start providing proper stewardship for this planet, moving away from the kind of greed, corporate greed of, say, the energy industry to keep burning carbon fuels. More than 100 years after we knew that burning carbon fuels would lead to global warming, we are now reaping the consequences of that. And that comes from greed and selfishness that ultimately is part of materialist thought. And it is time for a quantum informed model of consciousness, which shows the unity of mind and how we're all truly in this together to really take over and help this world to come to maturity.